Oh, hello, all the gorgeous little boys and girls out there. I've written another story for you all, and I have titled it George Frank, Scruffy the Gnome and the Time Machine. It was the 1940s. Under the bright-filled stars did little 3-year-old George lay. He was camping out in the garden with his older brother Frank, with their bed sheets used to make up a garden tent. Their mum had brought out bread and dripping and told them to come indoors in case the air raid alarm had set off, because if that happened they would need to take shelter quickly from the bombing planes above. George and Frank wanted to stay up and watch a family of hedgehogs that they had been following and studying ever since the baby hedgehogs were born. They were obedient to their mum, however, and went inside the house with her. George was not afraid of anything. Frank, on the other hand, was afraid of the dark, and the sisters were afraid of spiders. The brothers were supposed to bring in their torches back into their house, but that particular night they had forgotten to. Again, after the household had settled down for the night, all was at peace again. However, their father was absent because he was sailing warships in the deep dark oceans. The household all drifted off to sleep that night, but Frank constantly had recurring dreams of his father sailing the huge ships across the 7 seas of the world. It was always stormy in his dreams and pouring with rain. His father was always in his sailor's uniform, carrying a microscope and looking out of the boat window, constantly looking for a lighthouse and signs of the land. The next morning was a bright day, but a hairy spider ran across the living room. George and Frank looked at their sisters grinning and picked the spiders up and cornered their big sisters with the spiders. Their sisters, scared out of their wits' ends and spooked by the spiders, ran afraid past their brothers and outside the home. The family of hedgehogs were munching on slugs, but started walking away once the children had run inside. "We are telling Mum that you scared us with spiders," Joanne moaned. George pleaded. "Please don't tell her." Joanne and Katie looked at each other and smiled and said in unison, "On one condition, we can come to the river with you." George half smiled. "Very well." Frank looked to the hedgehogs. It was as if they were leading them somewhere. Frank then said, "Let's follow the hedgehogs to the river." Then all 4 siblings grabbed a jar together and skipped behind the hedgehogs to the river. The children spent the afternoon trying to catch tiddlers for their pond at home. Frank then asked, "Wonder when the war will be over," Katie replied. Yeah, I miss our dad." Joanne sighed. "Me too." George nodded. "The war being over cannot come quickly enough." Frank nodded. "Yes, I wish we were born in the future, like the year 2000. Just imagine if we could look into the future," George replied. "Maybe we can go to the future to see what it holds. But first we must find a time machine," Katie asked. "A time machine? From where?" Joanne replied. "There's no such thing. I wish there were. Then maybe we could know when the war will end, and we will see our future children and grandchildren, even maybe we will have great-grandchildren." George replied, "I wish there was no wars or fights or hatred, but only love." All of a sudden, George saw a very small-looking man hiding behind a tree. He walked over to the tree to look, but the small man had disappeared. Frank asked, "What are you looking for?" George replied, "A small man. I could have been so that the same that I saw The same man that I saw hiding behind this tree. Katy smiled. Maybe they are gnomes. Frank mocked. Don't be silly, gnomes don't exist. But then all of a sudden, 3 gnomes jumped out from the bushes they were hiding in. One gnome asked, Who told you that we don't exist? Frank said, Well, anyone knows that. The gnome smiled. But now you see me, so you can no longer say that we don't exist. Joanna Katy said in unison, We believe you. George nodded. Me too, the gnome smiled. It is rare for any human to see us with human eyes. We are only invisible to the human eye. But let me ask you, what brings you here? Frank explained, Our daddy's away. He would bring us here. We like playing here. It reminds us of us precious times that we was with him. The gnome smiled. I knew you would come today. I sent the hedgehogs to lead you here. It is true that you come to these woods, but you have never been deep into the woods as you are today. After the hedgehogs led you here, George asked, How did you know about us? The gnome replied, Because last night when you left your torches outside, you also left them on. We can see light, even just a match, a flicker for miles around. After you went to bed, we followed the light, passing through these woods. We came across your house, and because we are invisible, we did not get spotted. We have the power to watch people's dreams, and your dreams gave away everything about you and your family. Katy asked, But why did you bring us deeper into the woods? The gnome smiled. Don't worry about that for now. Let's just play for now. All the children nodded their heads. Then all the gnomes came out to play. They lit up the dark forest with rainbow lights. They splashed and swam with the children in the streams, rivers, ponds, and lakes. They used the mushrooms as drums. These woods were full of magic, wonders, mysteries, and woodland creatures unknown to the human eyes. The 4 children still very much wondered that maybe the gnomes would help them with their questions about time travel and the future. But they had not, and time was late, and they had to be going on their way home. The gnome said, You best be on your way, children. George smiled. I agree, and my siblings and I are getting hungry. By the way, I am George, and these are my siblings, Frank, Katy, and Joanna. The gnome smiled and replied, My name is Scruffy, and my brothers' names are Lumpy and Moonshine. My sisters' names are Ivy and Starshine. The children smiled and waved goodbye, and no sooner had the children turned around and the gnomes disappeared before their eyes, but George sighed strange. The other 3 nodded their heads and shrugged their shoulders. When they got home, they thought about the gnomes non-stop until the night came upon them. Their mum read them a bedtime story. It was about Scruffy and his siblings. So George sighed, That's impossible. We met Scruffy and his siblings today. Yet, the story is saying that they were around about 1000 BC. The mum chuckled. Well, that's enough of your imagination. Get some rest, children. They all fell asleep. Again, Frank had dreams of his dad. This time, in the dream, a giant squid had pulled his boat under the sea. The next morning, they got up bright and early. Wake up, let's go for a sneak out without our sisters and call for our friend Billy, whispered Frank to George. George smiled. Then the boys ran to the garden shed, got out their bikes and called for their friend Billy. The 3 boys set out towards the hill together. Billy asked, What are we going to do here? Frank replied, We are looking for a time machine. We've been told there is one in the thistles and thorns, but we need to get those thistles and thorns out the way in order to get to the time machine. Billy smiled. I have some matches. Let's burn them, the thistles out of the way. The three boys looked at each other, smiling in a mischievous way to each other. They hit the match against the box, threw the lit match within the thistles and horns, and giggled together, except the giggling got cut short when a huge explosion fired up through the thistles, up to the trees. The three boys got on their bikes and rode their bikes as fast as their little legs could carry them. Frank sighed. Promise me we are never going to mention what we did to anyone. The other two boys nodded their heads in agreement. However, before they knew it, fire engines had turned up to the hill and was putting out the fires. Frank sighed. Looks like there's no hope of getting hold of the time machine now. Billy asked, What's the big deal on finding a time machine anyway? Frank explained, Because last night I had yet another nightmare about our father finding a time machine to see into the future. The time machine could bring some reassurance to us that what I'm seeing, what I'm having, they are only nightmares, and that our father will come home again safe and sound. When they got home, they found their mum and sisters crying. Frank asked, What's wrong? Their mum replied, A fellow soldier brought us a telegram. There was a storm last night on boat, and your father was on board. But while the storm brewed, a giant squid pulled the boat under, and your father has been reported missing. Frank sighed. No, he is not. They ran outside the house again, with their mum calling for them, after them. Frank said, That is it. We are going to find this time machine. This time, Frank, George and Billy ran to some tall mountains and climbed up to the top of them. George asked, Which would be the point of finding the time machine now that we know Father is missing anyhow? Frank replied, Because my heart tells me he is alive and well, but we need to see the future to confirm it. Billy and George half smiled and nodded their heads in agreement. Billy asked, But how do you know where the time machines are every time? Frank pulled out a note from his pocket. It was handwritten by Scruffy the gnome, whom they had met before. Frank said, Because I have the instructions on this note. Up ahead were all shrubs, and the path was overgrown by sticking out branches. Frank turned to George and said, You are the only one small enough to carry on with this journey. You must go climb through the branches, and once you're on the other end, run as fast as you can, which will help you find the time machine. George did as his older brother told him. He scurried through the branches, then ran quickly once he reached the other side, except nothing had happened, and he still couldn't find the time machine. Apart from George running as fast, even faster, and then hearing a loud shout to stop. George looked back, and he looked around confused, as there was nobody around who could have possibly shouted. He, however, looked down to see a very steep drop. The voice had saved his life. George went back to his brother without a time machine. Frank was happy his brother was still alive, but confused as to why nothing happened with the time machine, that he could not find it. All of a sudden, Scruffy, Lumpy, Moonshine, Ivy, Starshine, and the rest of the gnomes appeared to the three boys again. Frank quizzed, This cannot be possible that you appear now, or that you appeared that time before, because according to our storybook at home, you were alive back in 1000 BC, which was even before the birth of Jesus. Scruffy nodded his head. It is true that we are from 1000 BC. You see, we too, like you, worried too much about the future. We wanted to know if gnomes and fairies were still going to be alive in the future, if our kind would still exist. So we had a meeting with an angel who agreed to send us into the future to see what the future would be like. Sadly, that angel only had the power to take us to the future, but he did not have the power to bring us back home to our time. We regret it now because we miss our homeland real bad, and the other creatures that lived back then. We should instead have trusted in our Creator for the future. This is what you children need to do. Just trust in the Creator and either dwell on the past or worry about the future. George looked at Frank and sighed. I guess he's right, because us fretting over the time machine did bring us more trouble than it's worth. Frank sighed. Yeah, I guess you're right, but where did that voice come out that scared George, and why did you give us the instructions on how and where to find a time machine if the instructions kept on only leading us into trouble? And not only that, and even worse, almost killing my little brother. Scruffy replied, well, at first the note that I gave you actually read, trust the Creator with the future. However, once you no longer trusted the Creator with your futures, your doubts gave the original message of the note power to change the wording. So when you read it with the wrong mindset, and it said something completely different from what it first said, and then it made it come out to say something completely different to what the first message had said. However, the Creator was not going to let George die, so he sent his angel down to protect him. Frank replied, I guess you are right, but I'm still worried about the future. Scruffy smiled. Do not worry, just give your cares to the Creator. He looks after all the birds flying in the sky. He will then surely take care of you and your mum and dad and siblings much more than he will the birds. Frank asked, really? Scruffy nodded, yes, really. Billy, Frank and George then ran back home. When they got home, they were overjoyed to see that their father was home. He was alive and well. It was also announced that the war was over. Apparently their dad had swam safely to the shore, to the rocks of the shore, along with all the other men that were aboard the ship, and every one of them also made it alive and back to safety. The lighthouse had given them the light in the dark, treacherous seas. After they all climbed on the rocks, they were helped by their opponents, the Germans, who fed them and nursed them, then brought them all back home before going back to their home in Germany. It was lovely to see people that had once been fighting each other, making peace with each other, and even friendships. That evening they had a special family celebration, which was followed with a bedtime story. That night their dad had read to them from the book filled with stories about gnomes and fairies, and the story for that night was about Scruffy and all the rest of the gnomes, how they had been caught in the 1940s and could not make it back to the year 2000, to the years 1000 BC, until of course they started to understand that worrying about the future would only make things worse, and until they gave put the future into the hands of the Almighty Creator. Once they had done that, a special magic arose in their hearts, which opened up the door to the time portal to go back to their present time in 1000 BC. Once again, they were back in their year, 1000 BC, and they were so happy to be being back with all their friends. And that is my story for you tonight, and I hope you all enjoyed it. God bless.